Я пропоную розпочинати.
So I suggest, dear friends, we start. Welcome everyone. And today we are attending our 12th lecture provided by the Urban Coalition for Ukraine Ro3kvit. And today we are talking about research results to be presented by our colleagues, Professor Dr. Philipp Meuser and Dr. Nataliia Mysak. And this research was done under the aegis of the European Bauhaus. And the topic for today is housing urgency in Ukraine from typologies of IDP homes towards a new housing system. Today, our lecturers are Professor Dr. Philipp Meuser, Managing Director of Meuser Architekten, Head of DOM Publishers, Honorary Professor of the Kyiv University in Kharkiv. Also, our second lecturer is Professor Dr. Nataliia Mysak, architect, researcher, founder of the Spatial Practices Laboratory, postdoctoral fellow at CASA ETH Zurich. I guess I should now give the word to our colleagues so that they would tell us about the results of their research. And today, I would like also to say that the lecture is presented in two languages. You can hear to the language of your choice by pressing the button on the bottom of your screen. So you're also welcome to give us your questions using the Q&A function and the chat, and we will try to answer those at the end of the lecture. Thank you very much, Margot, for your introduction. And then I would like to share my screen with you. So, good evening, everyone. Once again, I would like to reiterate that this research was initiated by the Covenant of Mayors under the aegis of the European Bauhaus. It was done last year during the summer and early autumn, and together with Professor Meuser, we aimed our research at research of the urgent housing emerging due to the invasion of Russia that started in February 2022. I would like to start from this slide. Here you can see the final result of our research, we summarized our results as this open matrix that summarizes the most characteristic typologies of urgent housing that emerged at the moment of our research, and we can use it to interpret the needs that are emerging in Ukraine. And we would like to comment on it later. So, to once again give you the framework of our research, I would like to say that the object of our research was urgent housing, emerging from the full-scale invasion by Russia in February, and the time frames are presented here on slide, February-October 2022 for the research period, and August to October 2022 when this research was conducted. The standpoint of our research is to consider architectural object by means of interdisciplinary optics, and this is our point of view, the perspective, and we take the point of view of architecture involving methods of adjacent disciplines to describe the architectural concept of typology. And talking about architectural typology, we would like to give you a brief theoretical introduction to give you the major notions that we are using in this research. And when we talk about typology, we are talking about a process. Typology is not something frozen in time. It is something changeable, and it is linked to the change of cultural situation. And typology as such is transforming during crises, during changes in the context of culture. And this is what we are witnessing now. And after a rather inert period of stable typology that we used to experience, now we are witnessing the situation when typology is changing very actively. On the other hand, we use the model of specific cases to draw conclusions, and we don't want to interpret them as static objects. We would like to interpret them as processes, because for temporary architecture, for crisis architecture, this life cycle is extremely important. The way the building transforms under this sum of external contexts. Also, when we are talking about the crisis of housing, we talk about quite often binary oppositions. When we talk about this, we talk about slow crises and fast crises, and this merits specific response. When we talk about swift crisis, it's a matter of survival. Long-term crisis requires more specific, in-depth answers responding to the priorities of the society on the whole. And there are quite a lot of binary oppositions in architectural discourse, yet we believe that it is much more productive to establish specific conceptual frames which could provide more variety. We can characterize it on the example of the housing continuum concept. This is the idea that housing has to be represented by various models, which are rather different, which should be affordable and accessible for various layers or strata of population in various situations. For instance, you can see on the screen such a housing continuum. And this is the urban agenda for the EU dated 2018, dealing with affordable housing. And here you can see these bullets representing housing accessible, affordable for all groups of the population. On the other hand, we have the housing system as a concept, and it is used in the resilience theory. This kind of housing system describes the continuum as not a linear phenomenon, but rather by something that involves individuals, institutions, resources, norms and expectations. And it involves a lot of factors, the abundance of which shapes the housing system and caters for its adaptivity. So we do not look into each element separately. We are looking at these elements in combination as a complex in a specific context. And we are talking here about the adaptive capacity and adaptive co-management. And in this context, we, of course, cannot talk about the system in more detail, but because it's broad, we would like to focus our attention to specific units which can lay the foundation for this housing system to be further developed into a more complex, comprehensive system.
Yeah, thank you very much so far. So Nataliia and me, we deeply hope that this academic context, what Nataliia was just giving, is extremely important for us. And it links our study, which was very pragmatic and which was the result of collecting information, collecting resources, collecting best practices from the first 8 months of the war. And we find that this is extremely important to have a link to all the other disciplines. And we also found out, and as we are all aware, that the housing market and the housing urgency in Ukraine is not only a subject or a political topic due to the war, but the housing structure in Ukraine in general needs a restructuring, it needs a modernization. And after 4 months after we have submitted or finished this study, we also find that it is important to discuss and continue discussing about housing strategy, even the war is still ongoing. Can we see the next slide, please? Can I get the, yeah, thank you. So what is this study on housing urgency in Ukraine about? So why did we do that? So the initial idea or the impulse was of course the existence of this acute housing crisis and the lack of instruments and strategic visions to solve it. And when we talk about the housing crisis in the first month of the war, all these IDPs, the refugees, completely confused the housing market in Ukraine. And for those who are not aware about the housing structure and the housing market in Ukraine, so you need to know that in Ukraine, more than 90% of the people live in self-ownership. So there's a huge percentage of home ownership in Ukraine, which is among the highest ratio in whole Europe. And just as if we would compare that in Switzerland, Austria, and in Germany, so the ratio is just 50/50 homeowners and tenants. And in Ukraine, we have 90% of, we used to have 90% of homeowners against 10% of tenants. And due to the fact that a third of the population in Ukraine is on migration, so which most of them are left the country, and another 7 million are IDPs, internally displaced people. So, and this confuses the market. The demand for housing, for tenant housing, is quite high. And so this was the housing crisis in the first month of the war, still today. But as I said before, the study is also about to think about a long-term strategy, how to solve this housing crisis as such after the war, because we are not talking only about reconstruction of destroyed buildings. We also need to talk about modernization of all the buildings. Nearly 70% of the buildings of the housing estates in Ukraine needs to be modernized. So we also need to talk about this. So that means the study, what we started as a study on refugee housing, so today this study is already the basis for us to think about the future of the housing market in whole Ukraine. So what is the study? What is the study about? So so we did not reinvent or invent something completely new. So we just tried to organize, to systematize information which was always still available, and we tried to do that as a first aid study, to collect this and to systemize it and to bring it into this study, to discuss it. And the study also functions as a kind of basis for other scholars, as a reference, so that all of us talk about the same numbers. All of us talk about with the same terms, technical terms. And this is also extremely important, because we talk, so whenever we have our panels and also this presentation, so we all speak, we're all using English words, but we are not English native speakers. So most of us are not, and we need to find terms to understand what are we talking about, and who is our target group. So the target group are mainly the local actors, municipalities, mayors, NGOs in Ukraine, private investors. When we talk about NGOs in Ukraine, we also talk about NGOs outside of Ukraine. For those who would like to do something, to do projects in Ukraine, they need to know what is Ukraine about, how is the housing market organized. So what is important to understand and important to make good and best decisions. So in the last months, it turned out that it is also very important for us, and also the study gets another importance in the international context. When I talk about the international context, it's not about Ukraine and Europe and aiding countries or aiding NGOs. No, we talk about other regions who also have crisis, and the crisis not only due to the destruction of war, but crisis due to natural disasters, crisis of economic parameters. So that means we started with our study, let's say the focus was on Ukraine, but the more we dive into the subject, we also find that Ukraine could, or to study Ukraine, the knowledge about Ukraine could help also to take actions and to prepare decisions in other markets, in other crisis regions in the world. Next. Excellent. So the study is organized in three parts. So the focus number one, so we identify current problems with the housing supply based on the experience of the local authorities. So we did an online survey. It was mainly done by Nataliia. So we sent out questionnaires and checklists to municipalities in Ukraine, and the response were quite good and quite fruitful. So Nataliia will focus on that later. So then we did a field research. So we visited some projects and some buildings which were implemented in the first month of the war. This was also extremely important to see and to meet the people, to talk to the architects, to talk to the decision makers. That also gives proof that those people who do the jobs in Ukraine, who do the decision making, and who are doing the physically planning and construction, highly motivated, open for a change. Not only in the change of identity and in defending the country, but it's also the demand for the change of the housing market. People are aware that then something needs to be change, and to understand and to transfer what we did in the study, and to transfer that to other cultural contexts, or to other geographical contexts. So in the end, we also developed some diagrams, and so let's say the diagramming was our third part, the third method, how to deal with this very, very complex and abstract subject on housing market in general, and housing of the future. So these three parts, and you can expect from now on, you can expect more images and more diagrams and less text.
Майже зараз. Так, що фокус перший, власне, буде сконцентрований.
So our first focus will concentrate on the results of our research, and we are very grateful to the authorities of the amalgamated Hromadas, 60 amalgamated Hromadas, who responded to our inquiries, and we are going to show you the results of these questionnaire. I'm not going to go into this situation on the housing market in depth, which Ukraine has used to have before the full-scale war. I would just like to give you a few figures concerning migration processes, and they are still affecting the housing models, temporary housing and urgent housing. I would like to say that the situation with migration is very dynamic. It is constantly changing, and we have noticed a few waves of migration during this half year of war. Everything was changing rather swiftly and radically, and in general, we can say 1/3 of the population of Ukraine left their houses, and it means that 1/3 of the country population lived not in their own houses, but required some alternative housing. And also, it is worthwhile to say that the conflict in Ukraine, in our opinion, showed us a very interesting phenomenon of refugee commuter, because quite a lot of IDPs moved twice, thrice during this time of war, and more than 1/3 of IDPs was moved more than once. And there are quite a lot of reasons for that. Some reasons are not so obvious. Other reasons are, so employment mattered, money mattered. Housing took only the second place in this rating of factors catering for redislocation. Other reasons include lack of social infrastructure, lack of access to medical services. Also, the need to reunite with one family also played its role. But we can say that in general, we need to foresee the need for such infrastructure, both social and technical, for IDPs to pre-plan it. Also, I would like to say that by September of last year, more than 60% of IDPs were planning to return to their homes, and only 11% were planning to integrate into their host communities. And it shows that the country really is in need of this flexible fund of stock of housing to respond to emergency situations and to house IDPs that will allow them to stay in it with dignity. And Also, I would like to return to the major actors responsible for the creation of temporary housing. Primarily, these were the representatives of the third sector, non-governmental organizations, and other actors in cooperation with the local municipal authorities, were resolving the issue of temporary housing, and these were them who created absolutely innovative patterns and models of housing. And our research was aimed on local administrations because they are very important actors in creating temporary and crisis housing. They are the ones who have quite a lot of levers to form the stock of municipal housing, part of which, of course, can be social housing for their communities. And now the results of the questionnaire themselves, you can see the analysis of the hromadas who took part in this research. They represent all sorts of typologies of hromadas. Some of them are urban hromadas, some are semi-urban hromadas. We also have hromadas centered around, concentrating around a village. So we have the full spectrum of hromadas. We also had some hromadas that did not suffer from the war. Unfortunately, our sample included also deoccupied and severely damaged hromadas due to the hostilities. It is also important to understand the places, the housing where the housing for IDPs provided by the hromadas. So mostly IDPs were using their own resources by renting an apartment. Some of them stayed with their friends or relatives. Some of them stayed with people they didn't know. And quite a big percentage of the hromadas hosted IDPs and housed them in shelters, administrative buildings, schools, equipped gyms, etc. It is also important to recollect here that while we were doing this research, practically all hromadas hosted IDPs. At the same time, part of the hromada populations gained the status of IDPs and moved to other territories. When we are talking about housing per se, and why housing is important for the hromadas, because first of all hromadas needed to provide housing for the coming IDPs. On the other hand, all the hromadas are trying to plan ahead, and they are trying to develop this flexible stock of housing, which they will have just for the case of for contingencies. And so they were planning also to provide some local housing for their local residents, and that is why housing is really an urgent problem for them. When we talk about the new types of housing that appeared in hromadas during the war, we can say that practically half of the research communities used adaptive reuse techniques of public buildings. For instance, they have repurposed community halls, gyms, kindergartens into shelters. Also, quite a lot of hromadas used non-residential buildings. And in 8 communities, there were already container settlements. So it's quite a high percentage. Many of the hromadas continued construction of housing by private developers, and some hromadas also constructed housing by the local authorities. And so this is the case of municipal housing being built. Also, another interesting fact, I guess, and it is rather motivating. More than half of the hromadas have stated that they were planning or they had already started constructing municipal housing. And to do this, they needed to acquire an absolutely new role for them, but they were ready to meet this challenge, to face this challenge. And another diagram shows here the variety of actors and which combination hromadas see as the most productive to provide housing for IDPs and for the local residents now and in future. And here you can see that we have a variety of opinions, and it is an important factor that shows that housing strategies must be designed locally, taking into account all the local context factors and with participation of the actors of the local level. And I guess I'm not going to stop here to present the conclusions to you. You can hit the pause and read the conclusions for yourself. But the major conclusion here is that a lot of hromada administrations are already assuming the responsibility for municipal housing construction, and they are ready to construct such housing in the future. At the same time, hromadas are all different. They all live in different conditions within the context of this war, and all hromadas have their own peculiar needs. Some hromadas have resources to design strategies. Other hromadas need to face immediate challenges and respond at once. And so we have a variety of hromadas here. And municipalities and hromada administrations, in our opinion, have a lot of potential in this respect. And to continue with our second focus, to illustrate using specific examples our system of housing that we have designed on the basis of the existing cases. Here we would like to show you the cases we have selected that illustrate specific typologies and which reveal both advantages and disadvantages, risks and opportunities which must be accounted for. So here we would like to show you and discuss a few examples. Most of you have already seen these examples. At the same time, these cases represent a specific typology very brightly. And the first case study is the shelter in Kyiv metro stations. And this is the usage of the existing precaution facilities that were actually constructed as shelters. And this is how they are being used during the shelling and in the first months in Kyiv. As a shelter, Kyiv Underground was functioning for 3 months from February to May 2022, and it was self-organized as a shelter, meaning that the whole bulk of humanitarian aid was brought there by volunteers, by some non-governmental groups, with a certain support on the part of municipality. And it is important to say here that in crisis situations like this, it is extremely important to understand what structures can be used as shelters, what structures can provide safety for a large number of people. In this context, logistics is extremely important. Awareness raising and psychological support are also of great value.
So the second case study what we selected was an underground car parking of finer town housing complex in Kyiv. A housing estate, a very, let's say, high quality, high level, high housing estate, which is still ongoing, the construction. And so the first phase was finished in 2019. And also here we have an example that air shelters were built due to the building law in Ukraine. And whereas nobody has ever thought that this should have been used as such. So this is a parking garage in this finer town housing complex. And it was, so the function was changed overnight. And you see this image. So we see some mattresses, some beds, some IKEA furniture standing around where cars were normally standing. And so this is just an example for many other 1,000, 10,000 of other basements which were used as a shelter during this shelling. And so yeah, so what is important to say is also that so we also bring that in context later. When we show these the diagrams, you will understand that this is so the basement of housing estates is one possibility, one example of existing precaution facilities as such as the metro stations, of what we just showed from Kharkiv, the example. When we talk about all these examples, so we try to identify or to mention parameters like aesthetics, like social components, also ecological components. And what is important to say for this parking garage, you see that the people immediately tried to individualize so this very rough concrete area by putting some own furniture, some water gallons and water cookers and whatever. So they just try to make it a livable space. But on the other hand, so we also found out, and this is what is the experience during all these shellings, so the acceptance gets fewer. So that means so the more air alarms raise, so the less people go to those shelters. And we would also like to discuss, or this is also part of our discussion when we are talking and in the context with other architects and developers, that there should be some ideas and examples to be implemented, that air shelters should not be in the basement of a building, and that during the night you go downstairs with your pajama and you see all the neighbors then sitting together in the basement. But preferred, and this is what we also heard from many users, so preferred would be some kind of refugium in the building, in the apartment, on the level, on the living level itself. So that is a model which is implemented in Israel. And so so this is ongoing, the discussion, so where to put and where to do some precaution for future air shellings. So how could that be implemented? So we have the public underground, the example from Kharkiv. So we have this semi-public basement garage, parking garage in those housing estates, but to have a private refugium inside the apartment. This would be the top solution if we need to to do some safety and security regulations for the future. Continue with number 3.
Наталя, я вас не чую.
Так, дякую за коментар. Так, власне, наступне.
Okay, so our next case study is the shelter in the Palace of Sport in Halachina. The sports hall was reorganized as a temporary shelter, and here the important fact is that the gym already has some infrastructure. There are some bathrooms, there are other premises which can be used to organize a shelter. At the same time, the choice of the shelter is also very important, because a very important factor is comfort, and this comfort is provided for by this modular framework made of cardboard and textile, designed by Shigeru Ban. And this structure, this framework, was assembled and adjusted to this gym by Lviv and Kharkiv volunteers. And after this case, it was used in a number of other shelters, and it improved comfort for the residents of such shelters. And the Bureau Drozdov and Partners have arranged rather a lot of such shelters, equipped a lot of such shelters with the framework that were produced by Polish manufacturers, which were also used, by the way, in Poland to house the IDPs. And of course, they are reusable. They could be disassembled and reassembled and transported to a new location. They are ecologically friendly. The solution is rather simple, and at the same time, it provides comfort for the IDPs. Another case study here is temporary modular houses, which were provided to the residents of Bucha. And an example you can see on the slide. This is a very light structure assembled next to the destroyed private house. And this structure enabled the people whose house was destroyed to stay next to it, to stay in the city that was their native city. And it was very important for some of them. And this allowed some of them to restore their permanent housing. And the container typology, module typology, a small housing typology, could be used to incorporate the goals of various strategies. So they could provide such quick and simple assembly and allow the people to stay next to their permanent homes. So this is simply a tent on slide here, and it is being assembled, and it was provided by the UN and local authorities. And also another example of such structures are more permanent containers in Kyiv and Vinnytsia regions, and they can be used for 10 years. the lifespan is 10 years, and they remain to be owned by the municipality. At the same time, they allow the people to stay in their native cities. Case study number 5 also features containers, but this is a different configuration. These are not singular containers. This is a container town. And this kind of housing is considered by many hromadas. Quite a lot of hromadas have plans about installing this kind of housing. We can use here the Ukrainian experience, because actually after the war that started in Donbass in 2014, Ukraine already was facing the need for housing, and 7 container towns were assembled in the east of the country. They were installed by GIZ in collaboration with the municipalities of the cities, and at the same time then they tried to disperse them and not to concentrate them in one city, but install them in several cities, so that the people who reside in such container towns would have more opportunities to integrate into the social environment of such cities. But these container cities have gone on for quite a lot of time since then. They're still functional, and there is no specific plan how to provide another kind of housing to the residents of such container towns. And so there is no hint of a plan like that, and it is very important to understand that this kind of settlements must have an accurately planned life cycle. And of course, it is easy to install such containers. At the same time, we must have the plan to disassemble such containers and to provide other kind of housing to the people who are currently residing in such containers. And the example of Lviv is a good practice. This is the first container town in Lviv. It was installed in the early months of the war. It was started in March, and in April it was already populated. It was installed in the sport grounds, practically in the downtown area, and the infrastructure is very adequate there, both social and technical infrastructure. And this container town was disassembled before the cold season because it was not calculated to house IDPs during the cold season. And so this is a good positive experience, and it is a very positive scenario of transforming this environment. And I would like to add here also that the container town has the main advantage of quick assembly. It is easily installed. The disadvantages include low comfort, and it is rather expensive to maintain. And so it is rather expensive to provide it with electricity and water. But to continue this talk about container towns, we need to take into account a lot of aspects, because this is one of the most common typologies of housing that we will have to tackle in the future.
So we continue with an example of container units designed by Baalbek Bureau from Ukraine. And so this is one of the most popular solutions, and most popular case study what we selected. So Baldek Bureau and Zelensky, they had a meeting which was broadcasted in spring last year already. And Baldek presented this container settlement. And if you compare that with case study number 5, the containers from Lviv, you see that there is another design approach, another architectural quality brought into these modules. Whereas we also found out, or it was said, that in the beginning, the idea was to build up to 5,000 units on a green field, to have a new village or a small city built out of these containers. So this has not been implemented, luckily, we have to say, because the reason why we are selecting this this example is that this is one of the high quality aesthetic solutions which is going to be partly implemented in near future in Lviv. And an interesting point is also that in contradiction to the example what we saw from Lviv on the sports ground, which was temporary for temporary use. So this is the idea. The idea behind is that this is installed not only temporarily, but could be developed as a permanent settlement. So this is also extremely important, because this is, if we compare that also with other regions where IDP and IDPs and refugees are confusing the whole housing market, temporary settlements are going to be transformed without any planning and strategy behind into permanent settlements. And the idea behind this Baldek modular system is that it is installed temporary, but will be turned into permanent residence after 2 years. So the people who live there for the first 2 years, so they might be offered to buy and to take over these units, and they can start a new life within this new social environment. So this example is not only important or interesting to see due to the fact that it is a nice aesthetic solution, but it is also a good, so what we find an interesting social solution, so community building and self-confident building structures. So that is also important to give hope. So architecture can act as a parameter of hope for the future and hope for a new identity and prosperous life. And of course, again, the problem that the cost is quite high. That is the fact that those units, whether they are temporary or permanently installed, need to be produced somewhere in a factory, transported to the site, lifted by a crane, and then of course, in the end, the costs are the same as if we would have a complete new high quality construction site or construction building. And so that's a fact. So we also have to see the pros and the cons, but here we see aesthetic and social impact is very high. And the next case study what we are showing is as popular as case number 6. So number 7, you might have heard about. Let me change it. You might have heard about the Kohati projects. Kohati is they started as NGO volunteers in Ivano-Frankivsk, young people who were IDPs themselves, but professionals from the fields, from many different fields, from construction, business, from architecture, from planning, from financing, from politics. So they all met in Ivano-Frankivsk and had the possibility to transform, to make a renovation, refurbishment of an empty dormitory of the local university into IDP housing. And the reason why it became so popular, so they did it in a very early weeks of the war, and CNN broadcasted, reported on this project, as one of the first initiatives in Ukraine made by young volunteers, and it became extremely popular. And so what we also value in this kind of strategy, how to take action themselves. So it's self-organized. Volunteers started this modernization project. So up to now they have 4 or even 5 projects done within the context of Ivano-Frankivsk, and everything turns into professionalism. So it started as a volunteer initiative, and it turned into professional. It's a service and a construction activity. So everything is do-it-yourself. So self-trained, extremely high professional young people, and so we would wish that this could be also a model in whole Ukraine, or maybe also a model for European civil societies to transform abandoned buildings into high quality, or let's say basic quality houses. And this brings us back to what we were saying in the beginning. So the case of Ukraine could help to not only sustain and transform the housing market in Ukraine. So all these examples could be helpful for Ukraine, but they could also be helpful for other European regions where the housing market is really weak. So let me continue with number 8.
Okay, so our next example will be number 8. Yep. And this is an example that touches upon a broader topic of specialized shelters for vulnerable groups of the population. In this case, we can see temporary housing for displaced pregnant women and women with children. At the same time, I can say that there is a huge demand for all sorts of rehabilitation centers, for various geriatric centers. So by this we mean some institution that can also provide not only the residential function, but some aid, some support to its residents. And this example is also architecturally important because it was constructed very swiftly. It was designed and constructed during 3 months, and the technologies used in it are rather simplistic. At the same time, the level of comfort is rather high, and this is a new typology. This is a typology that provides a lot of common spaces, public spaces to meet each other, to communicate, etc. And it also offers private spaces available for others. But the development of the common space, public space, characteristic for cooperatives, residential cooperatives, which are not very popular in our country, this example can start us thinking towards similar models for permanent housing. On the other hand, it is important to say that private, common and public spaces are equally important. So you can see that this project is located in the green zone next to a lake, and this creates opportunities for a social interaction between the residents, temporary residents, and local residents, residents of Lviv. And this is also very important for integration and the comfort or comfortable stay in this housing, in this house. And The authors of this project and the municipality had in mind that when these houses would become obsolete as temporary housing, they could transform into something else, acquire the function, acquire a new function, say, of a kindergarten, and such function could be beneficial for the community that is going to use it. And so this is the architectural thinking that is very fruitful. When we design a building, we should immediately think how it could be transformed in the future. And another example, study case number 9. Here we are also touching upon another important topic, rural territories and their development. We know that quite a lot of rural housing was ruined in the eastern territories, and the percentage is rather high. At the same time, around 35% of IDPs presently are staying in settlements, and 19 are staying in villages. And so rural territories should become one of the forces of thinking about housing and of housing solution for these people. And this situation can also stimulate the development of the village, and it poses new questions about the integration into rural communities and how these rural communities can transform. So this project is an adaptive reuse and reconstruction of an old farm, and this project, it has a lot of interesting aspects which can be studied and to be used later. On the one hand, this is technology, that is, the building materials are based on natural products. This is hemp beton, hemp concrete, and the technology is rather accessible and easy for DIY amateur constructors. And this is exactly the case. Future residents, the future community who are going to live in this house take part in construction, and this consolidates them as the community. This integrates them into the rural community, and at the same time teaches them some building skills. And they are already participating in master classes provided by the designers of this project. And now the designers are planning another block which will be coupled with a farm. Yet one more would be integrated with a rehabilitation center. And so this group of IDPs can be rather independent when they finally start living in these houses. And this is what provides hope for the development of rural territories and their integration into and revitalization. And our next example is case study number 10.
We are closing our list of case studies with an urban example. So what is important to say? So when we talk about knowledge transfer, what Nataliia was just mentioning in the terms of construction method in this rural area, so we also talk about this knowledge transfer also in terms of the strategies itself. And the city of Vinica, they had started a program, housing program in 2006, and the title, it was under the title Social Housing and Affordable Housing. So this is one example which was finished in 2022 in October. So whereas this has been started planning and construction before the war started, but it is important because this shows the strategy of what other municipalities should head to in Ukraine. So it's not only to sustain the privatized housing market, but it is also to take action as a city, take responsibility as a city, to also bring some social aspects into the housing markets. This is also home ownership. So these apartments are built under the patronage of the municipality, and then they are sold for around $350 to the tenants and to the owners, to the buyers. And so the social aspect is not to have low rents, but the idea behind is to bring low-income people or families into ownership of real estate. So it's quite interesting and liberal model of how to sustain and how to provide housing for the whole society. But the Vinica case is also very, very important when we talk about the future of housing, of communal housing in Ukraine. So we are very sure that we will. So we should all keep the name of the city of Vinica in our mind, because we might expect more models and more activities, and Vinica could act as a reference for other municipalities in Ukraine. So I'm continuing with focus number one, and then we are closing our presentation. So the number one, developing a housing system in Ukraine using 5 categories of housing. So this is the result of our study, and what method did we use? So we tried to identify, to visit, to see, to evaluate 24 of examples, and out of these more than 20 examples, we selected 10 to say, okay, these are the most prominent, the most typical examples, and we developed a system of housing typologies dedicated to the aspect of precaution, of emergency, but also in terms of housing for the future. So the categories are the shelters. So the shelters as precaution facilities, existing facilities, emergency housing, urgency housing, accelerated housing. So we will explain later what are the differences, and of course the standard housing, and this all brings us into the strategy, the housing strategy. So when we talk about this category number one, so you remember the metro station in Kyiv, you remember the parking garage from Fina Town, and you also remember this gymnasium where under the patronage of Figueroa, so this gymnasium was filled with temporary beds. So these are all precaution facilities, existing buildings, existing possibilities to house and to offer shelters to the people within a couple of hours. So this is our category number one. And this is something what municipalities always have, not only in terms of preparation or let's say defending against shelling in a war situation, but to have some facilities like this when it comes to natural disasters. So this is something what a municipality always has, but not in the scale of what it was needed in Ukraine. So we call the category number one shelters, precaution facilities. So when we come to the second category, so we find that so the title is emergency housing. and we say, so there should be what is also in many cities available, so modules in the storage and reserve, and whenever there is a case, it might be in case of war, it might be another crisis. So these modules could be assembled or could be installed within a couple of days. When we think about where should they be installed, so on the right hand side you see, we also showed you this example of these tents which were installed or built on those grounds where the single family house was destroyed, and so it was given to those families so that they can stay on their own ground, have a shelter, and could use this new shelter as a base to start repairing their destroyed home. But on the other hand, so we have so many examples where containers were put onto public grounds. So we're saying that this is our comic bubble. So whenever you have to decide, and the sports ground is the only area where you can install some containers. So please keep in mind, let some space left for the common use if you occupy public facilities. So this is also important. It's not only to provide shelter as such, but you always have to think about the social aspect. So it is not only to serve for those IDPs or refugees, but also you have to consider the neighbors, the people who live in this area. They are used to use this playground or the sports facility. So always think about, so it's not only the focus for the refugees and for the IDPs, always keep in mind the social piece is also very, very important. So we go to the category number 1. So number 3, so emergency housing and urgency housing. So then there might be not such a big difference in the wording itself, but for us it makes a difference. So the emergency housing is housing where the modules and the construction materials are already on storage, so you have them available. And when we come to category number 3, shift. It's not working yet. Yes, now it's working. So category 3. So we say, or we propose that the category 3, this is urgency housing, pre-approved projects, reuse, DIY, do-it-yourself, DIY projects, where there is no process of a time-consuming process of decision-making and getting an approval, getting a permission. So pre-approved, permission already available, but no material bought, but plans made, design approved. So whenever there is a disaster, you could immediately start with a project, make a tender, or try to procure all the materials which are needed. So you don't need to store it, but you get it from the market. And you must be you can be very fast because everything is pre-approved and plans have been made. So on the left hand side, you see these examples in the Baltic Bureau and Zulik partners, so the broken mothers. So we try to bring that also in the diagram and see that as a reference. So in the center, we see these Kohati projects, refurbishment of existing buildings, be creative in reusing abandoned buildings. So even an old hotel or an old administrational building from the railways might be interesting. Just be creative in reusing abandoned buildings. And what is also important, and I think this is very important to highlight again and again, so we are not only talking about the urban context, we must also talk about the rural context. And the example what Nataliia was mentioning with the hemcrete next south of Lviv, so do-it-yourself construction in this farming region. So I think this is also very, very important, not only focusing on this urban density, but also to develop and develop in an aesthetic way rural context. So we continue and go to category number 4. And category number 4 is a category which is also highly appreciated. So we also here we talk about new buildings, but also additional buildings, but also refurbishment or modernization of existing housing blocks. So this is something. So as we know, so more than 70% of the housing stocks in Ukraine, they are based on type designs, type projects. So we know that there are a certain number, around 20 type projects which were mainly built during Soviet times. Most of those types have been developed by Ukrainian architects. So they are spread all over Ukraine, and the idea behind this, or the thesis behind this, so once you know how to modernize and how to reconstruct, let's say the series 1438. So and you know how to do that in the western part of the country. You also know how to do it in the central part of the country, because it's just exactly the same building, not the same building, but the same type series, the same floor plan, the same technical equipment. And this is something what we try to identify, accelerated housing program, so that the municipalities and authorities support all those let's say this high-speed modernization processes. And again saying, so we are not only talking about reconstruction of destroyed buildings through the war, we also need to talk about the modernization of the whole housing stock in Ukraine. And what is also important, so look to our comic bubble. So a type project design can always have individual features. So we are not saying that type project means boring and repetitive facades and buildings. No. So the structure could be standardized, but facades and all the interiors and the finishings could be individual, so that in the end no one would ever think that it is a standardized building and everyone could live in a very individual environment. So, and we are also aware that after the war, most of the developers and the contractors, they continue building what they knew before the war, what they have been doing in the past 20 or even 30 years. So that means whenever we talk about the future of housing in Ukraine, we also need to talk about the standard housing, category number 5. So this is the market-orientated typologies. Just waiting for the next slide. Yes, it's coming. And we are aware that the standard housing complexes, what we know from Soviet times, what we also know from the post-Soviet period, and which are still under construction and planning in today. So we cannot ignore that also in future those housing complexes will be built. So we have to integrate that also in the huge, or in this complex and hilarious holistic approach of housing strategy. And again saying, so we need to talk about urban typologies, but we also need to talk about rural housing typologies, and of course we need to talk about densification of existing structures. So this is what we call housing, standard housing. You will find that more or less everywhere in the whole world. And now comes our next slide. So what we are saying, what is specific in Ukraine? So due to the war and due to these, a third of the population is migrating within the country or outside the country. The whole housing market came into movement. And what we are saying is, so Ukraine needs the long-term housing strategy, which is drafted Ukraine 2050, a long-term perspective, how to improve, how to diversify the existing housing round tables in 1,400 homadas and to discuss all typologies, to accept that there is this standard and let's call it boring housing complexes which were built in the past 20 or 30 years. So we cannot ignore those, but we also have to support bottom-up projects, young people, new ideas, young architects, creative architects. So whatever is possible, whatever is invented, or whatever is thought about, everything should be put under one umbrella, under one roof, for a long-term housing strategy which reflects on the needs of whole Ukraine. And just for those who are not aware what was going on in Ukraine, so we need to remind ourselves that Ukraine has no diversified housing market at the moment. So most of the buildings, most of the new construction is apartment, multi-story apartment blocks where you can buy your own apartment. This needs to be diversified, smaller groups of investors, so not this huge octopus in this housing market. No, smaller, break it down to a housing community, 10, 12 people, they group together and they are their own investor. So to support such kind of so-called Genossenschaften, so what we know from Switzerland, from Germany, from Austria. So this would be also something to support Ukraine by thinking about new typologies, not talking about typologies of design, architectural design, typologies of ownership, typologies of renting out buildings. So and the more typologies to develop, the better it is in the end. So we come to the conclusion. So here you see all together, and Nataliia will give the closing words.
Так, власне, спробуючи ще раз.
Yes, and I would like once again to collect all the typologies and all the approaches on one slide. By doing so, we are trying to show that there is a need in systematization of the factual materials we have, of constructing a matrix that will allow us to understand the interrelations between the typologies, that will allow us to see what kind of strategy specific municipalities might use to resolve the housing crisis. And here we tried to combine our categorization with CEDA's categorization, who have identified and categorized crisis housing in their report, and they subdivided it into short-term occupancy, medium-term occupancy, and indefinite occupancy. And this categorization overlaps with our classification. And you can see that emergency housing and urgency housing means medium-term occupancy. Our category number 1 corresponds to short-term occupancy. And so category number 2 and number 3 could be created on the basis of temporary or permanent structures, but both categories correspond to medium-term occupancy, temporary housing, and our category for accelerated housing, which could be the basis for municipal housing, for social housing, belongs to the category of indefinite occupancy. It is worthwhile to say that these divisions between the categories are rather blurred. Very often these categories are blurred, and within the first months of war, we focused on the first 3 categories of shelters, emergency housing, and urgency housing. So the time factor is extremely important, both in terms of building these shelters and the patterns of residency. At the same time, we are now living in the situation of experimentation because shelters emerged contrary to some legal procedures, and this gives us food for thought in terms of diversification, because this could be treated as precedents for new solutions, which could be legally approved and reflected upon. And our final conclusions for today will be the following. We would like to emphasize three aspects. During the first months of war, new actors came into the market and new models came into the housing market. And here, the third sector, municipalities, started to play a very important role together with non-governmental organizations, and they could contribute to social development, the development of social housing. And this is important for future research. Another aspect which is very important here is that we have already some beginnings of new experience emerging at different levels. For instance, interaction of DIY architecture, the open access architecture. These are all the examples, the first manifestations of alternative development routes for architecture. And there is also a great need for the exchange of experience, both at the level of municipalities and at the international level. And here we already have some positive development. And the last thing here, we would like to say that the housing question in Ukraine cannot be tackled by development of the needed amount of square meters, but it requires reconsideration of the whole housing sector, because the construction of the needed amount of square meters will not be a sustainable solution. And so there is a need to look for concepts which will allow us to forget about the binary opposition between the long-term and the short-term planning, which will provide us with new frameworks, new combinations, new spatial solutions. And finally, I would like to say that the systematization of housing could be of benefit for that. And I would like here to thank my audience for attention, and I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much, Nataliia, Philipp. And it is time for your questions. Please use Q&A function and chat to pose your questions. And I would like to start the discussion. You said that you have traced the role of the municipality and the non-governmental sector in this process. And how do you view the view of the architectural community in the development of these new typologies and promoting the best practices? I guess I can start responding to this question. I guess that here we need some synchronization in the process that we are witnessing. Only the professional community of architects, or only the community, or only the lawmakers on their own will not be effective, because this solution requires teamwork, and the role of the architects here is to be at hand and to monitor the processes and to respond and provide answers and solutions by using architectural tools to respond to the challenges and the questions. Okay, Philipp, would you like to add anything, or do you have other experience to share on behalf of the European countries?
So what I would like to emphasize is that, and this is also an open call to all the audience, for those who are watching live and who might watch it through YouTube and any other possibilities. Nataliia and me are developing this subject, and we are continuing working in this field. So we are currently preparing a kind of manual, a construction and design manual for housing, urgent housing, and urgent housing not only, so we mentioned that already in our presentation. So we take the cases from Ukraine, but we try to compare that and bring that into a context, in a more global context of urgent housing for the needs of housing due to destruction through war, through natural disasters and economic crisis. So and this also links to our study itself. It was initiated due to this extremely weak situation in Ukraine for the housing market. But and it was finished. In fact, the study itself is already part of history, because it only focused on the first 8 months of the war. Another 4 months have passed. We continue working in this field, and we see that the results are very, very useful, not only to develop strategies for today's Ukraine, but also for the possibility to transfer these categories or these parameters into other contexts. So we had this natural disaster, the earthquake in the south of Turkey, north of Syria currently, and also for this region, it might be helpful for the near future to think about how the reconstruction in Turkey could help to not only host temporarily the people, but how these refugee houses or refugee homes and settlements could act as a nucleus for a permanent settlement in the future. So we deeply hope that that this study could also help and encourage other scholars and other decision makers and other architects to link their study and their activities to our study, because this is what we need in the moment. We need solidarity among the people, and solidarity among the scholars, and solidarity among those who really suffer and take action. And what I can say as a non-Ukrainian, so the past year or the last year when I was closely working with Ukrainian friends and partners, so I have to say that I'm very confident that this self-conscious and bottom-up strategies, what Ukraine is famous for and well known for, so this could really help to find sustainable solutions for the future.
Philipp, Nataliia, so first of all, thank you so much for finding the time, first of all, to take part in this research, to accept the challenge, and during the war, during the crisis, come into Ukraine, visit different sites several times, making different iterations of the research and making it live and sharing it right now with public. So thank you. on behalf of Ro3kvit and me personally as a Ukrainian. Second, Philipp, I know you partially already answered the question, but there is a question in the Q&A session. It's in English, that's why I will read it aloud. Maybe you will still want to elaborate more on this topic. Maybe Nataliia will have something to add, so let me just read it. Thank you for the interesting input. Will there be also a lecture on the housing systems abroad? For example, Switzerland developed between 40s and 90s lots of building systems and is still using them. Also, yeah, we can learn a housing system after World War II. So we might not need to reinvent the wheel and build high budget garages for 15 families. So any comments here?
Yeah, I can directly respond to that. So we are aware that those 10 case studies what we were featuring in our study. So this is just a drop within an ocean. So so we didn't count how many people could live in those examples what we showed, but it would be 500 or so, or not even more. Let's make it 1,000. But there is a need, and there are already solutions for 40 million Ukrainians. So 7 million inside Ukraine, 7 million outside of Ukraine. So that means, so we do not even presented the peak of the iceberg. So and what is important is we tried to show the most typical of what has happened, and we also tried to identify aesthetically high performed examples. So because, and this also links us to the new European Bauhaus. New European Bauhaus is not only focused on social communities and the ecology and on climate change or climate friendliness, but it is also focused on aesthetics. And what we also know, and and that was the reason why we also presented these very nice designed projects. So a new identity, the possibility to start a new life in a new region, whereas it is in, doesn't matter if it is in Ukraine or outside Ukraine, in any other place in the world. So if you identify yourself with the aesthetics or with the architecture where you live in, it helps to find orientation within this new neighborhood, within the new region where you are deployed. So that means we also need to talk about architecture. And I'm very glad that Nataliia and me, we are both architects, and we were able also to focus on architecture. And this is also something we encourage everyone who is doing research in this field. And if you are not an architect, try to link your research or your study also to architecture, because architecture is also design, it is also aesthetics, but it is the whole holistic approach and the holistic parameters to find a better life for future.
Thank you, Philipp. Nataliia, would you like to add anything to this?
Так, я справді хочу сказати, що
thank you very much. I would like to say that the housing systems, to respond to the question, such housing systems really exist in various countries, and yes, they are shaped as integral wholes, and they have a lot of connections. For Ukraine, when we're doing this project, we were trying to take into account the context, take it as a point of reference, so that we could start from it, take these models as a starting point, and to discuss the advantages and disadvantages, because of course, to criticize, you need to look at them from the point of view of process, how they are working, not to look at them as a static architectural solution, incomprehensible in terms of functioning. So this structures, these housing structures can work in different parts of Ukraine. That is why we were talking about context so much, about residents, about municipalities, because temporary architecture is context dependent, is society dependent, and of course this project is about reintegration. It is because it is much easier to reintegrate when your environment is aesthetically pleasing, when it supports your dignity. And so, yes, we were also trying to take into account the social advantages and social risks that each of these typologies is fraught with.
Nataliia, thank you so very much for this very important add-on and the message. I do hope that the attendee who posted this question is now satisfied. Thank you. There's one more question, and most probably we'll need to wrap up. So the question from Arina: if we talk about the shelters or containers built fast as a very short-term accommodation, how do you think they're actually going to be recycled? Philipp, would you like to answer that, or Nataliia?
We don't know that yet. So we can only hope that those who provide the containers, who receive the containers, they are aware that they are very expensive, and they will find another use for that. And so this is what we also would like to encourage and to initiate. So whenever you have to place a container, and there will be containers to be placed in the near future in Ukraine, of course. So try to think about how those containers, or how those configurations of containers could be used in future for other purpose. So you use it as a nucleus for an existing or growing, another growing building. So this could be one example, but it could be also possible to reinstall or to disassemble these containers and bring them somewhere else, whereas you have to consider that there is high cost for transport. So better think about keep it where they are. Maybe they could be used as shelters, they could be used as storage, or they could also use as a garage. So, but the container as such could be recycled as a container. So we should not think about how to separate the different materials and try to recycle the materials. So the best solution would be to find a new use, or let's say a new life for the containers itself.
Я лише, можливо, додам до цього,
I guess I can add here that really most of the containers that Ukraine is now receiving, they are landed for 1 year with an opportunity to continue using them. After that, they will be returned to the European Foundation that would be transport them to another location. At the same time, we understand that quite a lot of scenarios of container towns can be created, and we must really give it a thought how to use such containers in the future. For instance, if these containers are installed in the east, they are in good shape. The shell is robust. The interiors would get outdated, but the shell is robust, and the container can be reused many times. And on the other hand, the containers that are produced in Ukraine are of different quality, and they must use a different approach to reuse and recycle them. Dear Nataliia, dear Philipp, thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is up and we have to close today. Thank you very much for your research and your presentation. And this presentation will be available in English and in Ukrainian on our site on the side of the Ro3kvit urban coalition. So you will have an opportunity to look at them at your leisure. And should you have any more questions, please give us some feedback. We are always glad to get your feedback. And I would also like to continue the topic of housing. This is not the last research done but by our partners and colleagues. And presently, one of our colleagues, Mr. Antipenko, in Budapest University of Technology, is doing his PhD research on the transformation of Soviet time housing districts. And so if you live in such a district, welcome to participate in his research. His contact is in our chat. Please have a look, because housing is a broad topic. We can explore very many aspects related to it. Dear Philipp, dear Nataliia, thank you very much for your presentation today. And everyone, see you in our lectures. And finally, I would like to say that this cycle of lectures of Urban Coalition Ro3kvit is supported by the International Renaissance Foundation. Thank you very much, everyone.